The autumn of 1887 brought the final run of the luxurious riverboat Delta Queen, her brass fittings gleaming as she churned through fog-shrouded waters of the lower Mississippi. Wealthy passengers savored what they believed to be the finest cuisine on the river, prepared by Chef Silas Rook, whose culinary artistry had earned whispers of reverence from New Orleans to Memphis. Travelers had begun to vanish on overnight stretches, disappearing without trace into the mournful darkness. Official records spoke of accidents, of drunken falls overboard, but the truth investigators would uncover was far more intimate, far more horrifying. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The celebrated chef had discovered perfect ingredients for his masterpieces, ingredients that walked aboard on two legs and paid their own fare. This was not just murder, this was an operation that fed on human lives, where the line between passenger and provisions had been erased by a man who saw no difference between butchering livestock and serving his fellow human beings. Picture, if you will, the grand dining saloon of the Delta Queen on the evening of November 3rd, 1887. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across tables draped in pristine white linen, while the gentle thrum of the great paddle wheel provided a rhythmic backdrop to the clinking of silverware against fine china. At the captain's table, Miss Lillian Dubois, a socialite from the Garden District, raised her fork with theatrical delight. "Chef Rook," she proclaimed to the assembled diners, "this pork loin is absolutely divine. I have never tasted anything so tender, so perfectly seasoned. You must share your secret." From the galley doorway, Silas Rook emerged with that peculiar smile that never quite reached his eyes, wiping his hands on a pristine white apron that somehow remained spotless despite hours of preparation. "The secret, Miss Dubois, is knowing your meat," he replied in that low, measured voice that seemed to carry the weight of the swamps in its cadence. Fresh ingredients, properly aged, and an understanding of what makes each cut special. The diners murmured their appreciation, returning to their meals with renewed enthusiasm. None of them noticed the slight tremor in the hands of the purser, who had spent the afternoon fielding increasingly frantic inquiries from a gentleman in stateroom 14. His brother, a traveling Bible salesman named Marcus Webb, had not been seen since the previous evening's dinner service. "Men sometimes wander off in the night," the purser had explained with practiced dismissal. "The river calls to them, you understand, the romance of it all." But Marcus Webb had not wandered anywhere. 24 hours earlier, he had complimented Chef Rook on the very same pork loin, unaware that he was praising the remains of the previous victim. And now, as the elegant passengers of the Delta Queen savored their evening meal, they were unknowingly participating in a communion far more intimate and horrifying than any of them could imagine. What they consumed that night was not pork at all, but the carefully prepared flesh of Marcus Webb himself, a man whose final contribution to the world was to provide sustenance for his fellow travelers. The truth of what happened in the galley of the Delta Queen was far more terrible than simple murder, for it transformed every meal into an act of unwitting cannibalism, every compliment into an endorsement of the unspeakable. The Delta Queen was no ordinary riverboat, but a floating palace that embodied the excess and ambition of the Gilded Age. 260 feet of gleaming white wood and brass, she boasted 3 decks of luxury that could accommodate 150 passengers in opulent comfort. Her great paddle wheel, 30 feet in diameter, churned through the muddy waters with mechanical precision, while twin smokestacks belched columns of black smoke into the southern sky like industrial prayers. But it was her route that made the Delta Queen particularly suited for the horrors that would unfold within her hull. she plied the lower Mississippi between New Orleans and Vicksburg, a stretch of river that passed through some of the most isolated and lawless territory in America. Here the mighty river meandered through endless miles of cypress swamp and bottomland, where fog could swallow a vessel whole, and the nearest help might be days away by horseback. The most treacherous portion of this journey lay in the region known as the Honey Island Swamp, a vast maze of waterways, moss-draped trees, and shifting sandbars that had claimed countless vessels over the decades. Local pilots spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of currents that could drag a boat into hidden channels, of quicksand that could swallow a man whole, and of the strange folk who lived deep in its green shadows. These were the people rivermen called the gutter folk, a clan said to be so inbred and isolated that they had forgotten the rules of civilized society. Parents told children stories of pale figures in rotting skiffs who emerged from the fog to steal livestock, or worse. Most dismissed such tales as superstition, the kind of folklore that thrived in places where education was scarce and darkness came early. Above deck, the Delta Queen presented herself as a beacon of civilization, her salons filled with polished mahogany, crystal, and the gentle melodies of a steam calliope. Passengers in their finest attire strolled the promenades, sipped imported wine, and discussed business deals worth fortunes. But below, in the maze of service corridors, engine rooms, and storage holds, the boat revealed her industrial heart. Here, immigrant and black workers toiled in sweltering heat, feeding coal to hungry boilers and maintaining the complex machinery that kept the vessel moving. And it was here, in the deepest recesses of the Delta Queen, that Chef Silas Rook had transformed the galley into something far more sinister than a simple kitchen. The river provided perfect cover for his operations, a liquid highway between civilization and wilderness where the normal rules of society dissolved like morning mist. Silas Rook arrived at the Delta Queen in the spring of 1886, like a ghost materializing from the swamp itself. No one could say exactly where he had come from, only that he appeared at the New Orleans docks one morning with a battered leather satchel containing the finest set of butcher's knives anyone had ever seen. The previous chef had died suddenly of fever, and Captain Holloway, desperate to maintain the boat's reputation for fine dining, hired Rook on the spot after tasting a simple beef stew the stranger prepared from galley scraps. What struck everyone first about Rook was his hands. They were the hands of a surgeon and a slaughterman combined, long-fingered and precise, but crossed with a network of old scars that spoke of intimate familiarity with sharp steel. When he worked, there was a poetry to his movements, a rhythm that seemed to echo the ancient cadence of predator and prey. He could break down a side of beef faster than most men could carve a chicken, his blade finding every joint, every seam with surgical precision. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled those who worked closely with him. They held the cold intelligence of a man who saw the world in terms of meat and bone, who looked at every living thing and calculated its weight, its tenderness, its potential. The kitchen staff learned quickly not to question his methods or his ingredients, especially after the incident with the sous chef, who had grown too curious about Rook's private stores in the cold locker. The rumors about his origins began almost immediately. The older hands whispered that he bore the mark of the gutter folk, that legendary clan of river pirates and degenerates who were said to inhabit the deepest reaches of the Honey Island swamp. These were not merely criminals, the stories went, but something far more primitive, a people who had retreated so far from civilization that they had forgotten what it meant to be human. According to the tales passed down by generations of rivermen, the gutter folk were the remnants of the earliest settlers who had fled into the swamp during the chaos of the Civil War. Cut off from the outside world, they had formed their own twisted society one built on blood ties so close they bordered on the unspeakable. Generations of intermarriage had produced a people marked by pale skin, strange physical deformities, and an appetite for flesh that went far beyond the normal hungers of civilized men. The evidence seemed to support these whispers. Rook spoke with the peculiar accent of the deep swamp, a dialect that mixed French patois with something older and more guttural. He knew things about the river that only someone raised in its shadows could know, the hidden channels and secret waterways that didn't appear on any chart. And there was his uncanny ability to predict when river pirates might strike, as if he possessed some supernatural connection to the criminal elements that plagued the Mississippi. Most disturbing of all was the bone-handled cleaver he carried, a massive blade whose ivory grip was carved with symbols that resembled no Christian iconography anyone could recognize. The weapon seemed almost alive in his hands, an extension of his will that could separate flesh from bone with a whisper of steel through air. The crew members who dared to speculate about his past did so in hushed tones, far from the galley where Rook's acute hearing might catch their words. They spoke of a man caught between two worlds, equally at home in the refined atmosphere of the dining saloon and the primal darkness of the swamp that had spawned him. The first disappearance occurred on a humid September night as the Delta Queen navigated the treacherous waters near Point Coupé. Harold Pembroke, a traveling salesman from St. Louis, had spent the evening in the smoking lounge boasting about the roll of bills in his jacket pocket, money earned from a particularly successful trip selling patent medicines to rural pharmacies. He was the type of passenger other travelers found insufferable, loud and crude, with a tendency to corner anyone who would listen with tales of his commercial conquests. $3,000, he had proclaimed to anyone within earshot, patting his breast pocket with drunken pride. More money than most of these river rats will see in a lifetime. His voice carried the particular arrogance of a man who believed his wallet made him invincible, even in the lawless stretches of the lower Mississippi. When morning came, Pembroke's stateroom was found undisturbed, his bed neatly made and his luggage untouched. Only his money was missing, along with the man himself. Captain Holloway ordered a perfunctory search of the vessel, more for the sake of appearances than from any genuine hope of finding the missing passenger. The crew dutifully checked every storage compartment, every service corridor, every possible hiding place where a man might have wandered in a drunken stupor. Dr. Havelock, the ship's physician, examined the empty stateroom with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many such incidents over the years. "Drunk as a lord when I last saw him," he informed the captain with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Probably stumbled over the rail while taking the night air. The current here is particularly strong, you know. Body likely swept downstream already." The official explanation satisfied most of the passengers, who were eager to return to their comfortable routines rather than dwell on unpleasant possibilities. Death was a common companion on the river, where men regularly fell victim to disease, accidents, and the occasional bout of violence. One missing drunk hardly qualified as a mystery worth prolonging their voyage. But Chef Rook's reaction to the news was what those few who noticed would later remember with growing unease. While others expressed appropriate concern or sympathy, Rook received word of the disappearance with an almost serene calm. "Shame about Mr. Pembroke," he remarked to his kitchen staff, his tone carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. "Still, I suspect the catfish will eat well tonight." The comment might have been dismissed as merely crude humor, the kind of gallows common among working men, except for what appeared on the dining menu the following day, where the usual offerings of chicken and standard beef cuts had been listed. Passengers found instead a new specialty, Chef Rook's prime cut of beef, aged to perfection and seasoned with herbs from the river country. Those who sampled the dish that evening would later swear it was the most tender, most flavorful meat they had ever tasted, with a richness that seemed to linger on the tongue long after the meal had ended. The texture was unlike any beef they had encountered, finer somehow, more delicate, with an almost sweet undertone that defied explanation. It was the first thread in a tapestry of horror, and had anyone possessed the courage to pull it, the entire grotesque design might have unraveled before more lives were lost to Chef Rook's twisted artistry. Elias Thorne boarded the Delta Queen at the New Orleans wharf on October 20th, 1887, carrying nothing more than a worn leather valise and a physician's note recommending extended rest and therapeutic travel for what the doctor had diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion. The truth was far simpler and more bitter. Thorne had failed spectacularly in his last case for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, allowing a suspected murderer to slip through his fingers and vanish into the Chicago underworld. The failure had cost him his confidence, his sleep, and very nearly his sanity. His supervisor had been blunt about the remedy. "Take 6 months, Thorne. Find yourself a nice, quiet corner of the country where nothing ever happens, and remember what it feels like to be human again." The Mississippi Riverboat cruise had been suggested by his physician, who believed the gentle rhythm of the paddle wheel and the pastoral scenery would prove restorative to his fractured nerves. What Thorne had not anticipated was how quickly his professional instincts would reassert themselves despite his prescribed convalescence. Even before the Delta Queen had cleared the New Orleans harbor, he found himself cataloging the security weaknesses of the vessel, noting the casual attitude of the crew toward passenger safety, the inadequate lighting in the service corridors, and the numerous blind spots where someone could vanish without being observed. Among his fellow passengers, Thorne encountered the usual collection of river travelers. Miss Lillian Dubois, barely 20, and possessed of the kind of naive enthusiasm that marked her as old New Orleans aristocracy, chattered endlessly about her first grand adventure away from her family's Garden District mansion. Her excitement was infectious. But Thorne noticed how she seemed oblivious to the calculating stares of some of the rougher passengers, particularly when she mentioned her father's shipping fortune. More intriguing was Cora Mayhew, the sharp-eyed lady's maid traveling with a wealthy merchant family from Memphis. Unlike her employers, who seemed determined to see only the romance and grandeur of river travel, Cora possessed the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to survive by paying attention to details others missed. Thorne caught her studying the crew with the same professional assessment he himself employed, and recognized in her the kind of ally who might prove invaluable if trouble arose. Reverend Abraham Finch presented a different sort of puzzle. The fire and brimstone preacher from rural Mississippi carried himself with the rigid moral certainty of a man who saw sin and corruption everywhere he looked. His sermons during Sunday service aboard the boat focused obsessively on themes of consumption and gluttony, delivered with a passion that seemed to border on personal obsession. Thorne noted how the Reverend's eyes followed Chef Rook whenever the cook appeared in the dining saloon, as if he sensed something fundamentally unwholesome about the man. It was Tom Grady, the boat's Irish carpenter, who provided Thorne's first real hint that all was not well aboard the Delta Queen. Grady had worked riverboats for 15 years and possessed the kind of intimate knowledge of ship construction that comes from crawling through every inch of a vessel's framework. During a casual conversation on the cargo deck, he mentioned the strange sounds that echoed through the hull during the night hours. "Sounds like someone dragging heavy sacks," Grady confided, his voice barely audible above the churning of the paddle wheel. "But when I go to investigate, there's never anyone about. Just that smell, like a butcher shop that needs cleaning." The horror of what Chef Silas Rook had created aboard the Delta Queen was not simply murder, but rather a sophisticated operation that transformed the luxury riverboat into a floating abattoir. The system he developed was elegant in its simplicity, terrifying in its efficiency, and perfectly suited to the isolated environment of the Mississippi River, where help was always days away and bodies could disappear without a trace. Rook's first step was always selection, a process he approached with the cold calculation of a livestock buyer at market. He favored passengers who traveled alone, particularly those who had made the fatal mistake of flaunting their wealth or mentioning their lack of connections waiting for them at their destination. Salesmen were ideal targets, as were gamblers, drifters, and the occasional wealthy widow seeking adventure far from the constraints of polite society. These individuals possessed two crucial qualities. They carried enough valuables to make their disappearance profitable, and their absence would not be immediately noticed by anyone with the power to demand a thorough investigation. The selection process was aided by a network of informants that extended far beyond the confines of the riverboat itself. The gutterfolk, Rook's extended clan from the Honey Island swamp, maintained a shadowy presence along the river route. They operated from small skiffs and pirogues, seemingly harmless fishermen and trappers who possessed an uncanny ability to appear wherever the Delta Queen made her scheduled stops. These watchers would identify potential victims among passengers boarding at remote landings, sometimes even following the riverboat for miles while communicating with Rook through a system of coded signals involving lantern flashes and steam whistle patterns. The actual murders took place during the darkest hours of the night, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning, when even the most restless passengers were deep in sleep. Rook would emerge from his quarters with the silent precision of a surgeon, moving through the service corridors and crew passages that honeycombed the lower levels of the boat. His years of experience had taught him every creak and groan of the Delta Queen's aging timbers, allowing him to navigate in complete darkness without making a sound. The victims were approached in their staterooms, often while they slept off the effects of the evening's entertainment. Rook's preferred method was swift and silent, a razor-sharp blade drawn across the throat in a single practiced motion that severed the carotid arteries while preventing any cry for help. Death came within seconds, and the massive blood loss that followed was contained by heavy canvas sheets Rook had purloined from the ship's sail locker. What happened next revealed the true depths of Rook's depravity and expertise. The bodies were transported to the galley's cold locker, a large refrigerated compartment originally designed to preserve the boat's supply of fresh meat during the long river voyages. Here, in the icy darkness, Rook would practice his unholy craft with the skill of a master butcher and the methodical precision of a surgeon. Every part of the victim was utilized with the efficiency that would have impressed a Chicago meatpacker. The choicest cuts were reserved for the dining room, carefully prepared and seasoned to disguise their true origin. Tougher portions were ground for sausages or stewed into rich gravies that masked any unusual flavors. Bones were either fed into the boat's massive boilers, where the intense heat reduced them to ash, or weighted with chains and dropped overboard during the deepest stretches of the river. The disposal of evidence was equally systematic. Clothing and personal effects were searched for valuables before being burned in the galley's furnaces, or bundled with rocks and consigned to the muddy depths of the Mississippi. Blood was diluted and flushed through a specially modified sluice system that Tom Grady, the carpenter, had unknowingly helped install, believing it was designed to improve the boat's waste management. The final element of Rook's machine was, perhaps, the most chilling: the complete complicity of silence from those who might have suspected the truth. Captain Holloway's willful blindness was purchased through generous bonuses that appeared in the steamship line's accounting ledgers as operational incentives. Dr. Havelock's cooperation was secured through a steady supply of medicinal alcohol that kept the aging physician too intoxicated to ask inconvenient questions about the growing number of passengers who seemed to simply vanish into the night. The cracks in Chef Rook's carefully constructed facade began to show during the third week of October, when Cora Mayhew's sharp eyes caught something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. As the personal maid to the wealthy Pemberton family, Cora had developed the servant's gift for moving through the world nearly invisible, her presence so commonplace that others spoke and acted as if she were merely part of the furniture. It was this invisibility that allowed her to witness what she would later describe to Elias Thorne as the most chilling sight of my life. She had been retrieving laundry from the crew quarters when she discovered one of Rook's work aprons hanging among the chef's personal effects. In the dim gaslight of the service corridor, what she had initially taken for rust stains revealed themselves to be something far more sinister. Dark crimson blotches that had soaked deep into the fabric, too extensive and too deeply embedded to be explained by normal kitchen accidents. "Mr. Thorne," she confided during a carefully arranged meeting on the cargo deck, her voice barely audible above the constant churning of the paddle wheel. "I have worked in kitchens since I was 12 years old, and I know the difference between the blood of a chicken and the blood of something much larger." Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice remained steady with the kind of resolve that comes from witnessing something that cannot be ignored. Thorne listened with growing alarm as Cora described other disturbing observations that had accumulated over the weeks of the voyage. She had noticed how Chef Rook's special menu items always appeared following the disappearance of a passenger, how the man seemed to possess an supernatural ability to estimate the exact weight and measurements of the missing individuals, and how his requests to the ship's purser for additional specialty ingredients never seemed to correspond with any deliveries from shore. Tom Grady, the ship's carpenter, provided even more disturbing testimony when Thorne approached him with carefully chosen questions about the boat's infrastructure. The Irishman's weathered face grew pale as he described the modifications he had been asked to make to the galley's drainage system over the past year. "Captain Holloway told me it was for improved sanitation," Grady explained, his accent thick with emotion. "But I've been working boats for 15 years, and I've never seen a galley that needed a sluice gate connected directly to the river. When I asked the chef about it, he just smiled that cold smile of his and said it was for washing away the scraps." More chilling was Grady's account of the sounds that echoed through the ship's framework during the darkest hours of the night. The rhythmic thumping he had initially attributed to cargo settling in the hold had a different quality when heard from within the ship's wooden bones, sharp, precise impacts that seemed to follow a pattern, like someone chopping wood with mechanical regularity. "It's always around 3 in the morning, Grady whispered, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "Lasts about an hour, then stops as sudden as it started. And there's another sound, too, like something heavy being dragged across the deck plates. But when I go to investigate, everything's quiet as a tomb. Even Reverend Finch, despite his obvious reluctance to involve himself in what he called worldly investigations, could not ignore the spiritual weight of what he had observed. The preacher's condemnation of Chef Rook went far beyond mere personal dislike, rooted instead in what he described as a fundamental corruption of the natural order. "That man treats the preparation of food like a pagan ritual," Finch told Thorne during a tense conversation in the boat's small chapel. "I have watched him work, Mr. Thorne, and there is something unholy in the way he handles meat, as if he takes a perverse pleasure in the act of butchery itself. No Christian man should find such joy in dealing death, even to livestock." The Reverend's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued. "And the way the passengers praise his cooking, the way they seem almost intoxicated by the taste of his special preparations. It reminds me of the old stories about communion with dark forces, about flesh that feeds more than just the body." The disappearance of Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a traveling schoolteacher from Baton Rouge, on the night of November 1st, finally forced Captain Holloway's hand. Unlike the previous vanishings, which had involved passengers of questionable character or limited social connections, Miss Hartwell was a respectable woman from a prominent family, one whose absence would certainly be noticed and investigated by authorities with real power to demand answers. Elias Thorne seized upon the captain's obvious anxiety, confronting Holloway in his private quarters with the accumulated weight of his suspicions and the testimony he had gathered from the crew. "3 passengers have vanished from this boat in as many weeks," Thorne stated with the cold authority of his former profession. "Either you conduct a thorough search of this vessel, or I will ensure that every newspaper from New Orleans to St. Louis learns about the Delta Queen's peculiar record of losing its paying customers." Captain Holloway's face flushed red with indignation, but beneath his bluster, Thorne detected the unmistakable signs of genuine fear. The man was terrified, not of what they might find, but of what the discovery might mean for his carefully constructed arrangement with Chef Rook and the lucrative bonuses that had funded his comfortable retirement plans. "This is preposterous," Holloway sputtered, but his protests lacked conviction. "You cannot seriously suggest that someone aboard my boat is responsible for these unfortunate accidents. The river is dangerous, Mr. Thorne. People fall overboard. It is a tragic but common occurrence." But Thorne pressed his advantage with the relentless logic that had once made him one of the Pinkerton Agency's most effective investigators. He pointed out the mathematical impossibility of so many solo passengers meeting identical fates, the suspicious timing of Chef Rook's special menu offerings, and the growing unease among crew members who had begun to whisper about strange sounds and odors emanating from the galley during the night hours. Faced with the threat of public scandal and the potential involvement of federal investigators, Captain Holloway reluctantly agreed to conduct what he termed a comprehensive inspection of the vessel to reassure our passengers and put these wild rumors to rest. The search began at dawn on November 2nd, with Thorne accompanying the captain and a small group of crew members as they methodically examined every accessible area of the Delta Queen. They started with the obvious locations: storage compartments, unused staterooms, and the various service areas where someone might conceivably hide a body or evidence of foul play. Chef Rook received news of the impending inspection with an unsettling calm that immediately raised Thorne's suspicions. While other crew members showed natural curiosity or concern about the unusual proceedings, Rook continued his morning food preparation with the same methodical precision he displayed every day. His only acknowledgement of the disruption was a slight smile that never seemed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Gentlemen," Rook said when the search party finally reached the galley, "I welcome this opportunity to demonstrate the cleanliness and efficiency of my operation. As you can see, everything is in perfect order." And indeed, the galley appeared immaculate. Every surface gleamed with recent scrubbing, every tool was precisely positioned, and the air carried only the wholesome aromas of bread baking and coffee brewing. Thorne found himself almost questioning his own suspicions in the face of such apparent normalcy. But it was the cold locker that drew Thorne's attention like a lodestone. The heavy door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within, yet something about the space felt wrong in ways he could not immediately articulate. When he moved toward the compartment for a closer examination, Chef Rook smoothly interposed himself between Thorne and the locker door. "I'm afraid that area is temporarily out of service," Rook explained with practiced ease. "The refrigeration mechanism has been malfunctioning for several days. Quite unsafe to enter until the repairs are completed." Captain Holloway seized upon this explanation with obvious relief. "Well, there you have it, Mr. Thorne. Nothing to see here but a broken icebox. I think we can consider this matter closed." But Thorne noticed several troubling details that the captain seemed determined to ignore. The cold air that continued to flow from the supposedly malfunctioning locker, the fresh scratches around the doorframe that suggested recent and frequent use, and most disturbing of all, the faint metallic odor that seemed to emanate from within the darkness, a smell that reminded him uncomfortably of the aftermath of violence. Following the inconclusive search of the galley, Elias Thorne found himself wrestling with a frustration that gnawed at his professional pride like a physical pain. Every instinct honed by years of detective work screamed that Chef Rook was hiding something monstrous behind that cold locker door, yet he had no concrete evidence to support his suspicions. It was then that his methodical training suggested a different approach. If bodies were disappearing, then somewhere in the boat's operations there should be discrepancies, numbers that failed to balance, evidence written in ledgers and receipts rather than blood and bone. The opportunity came when Thorne befriended James Wickham, the Delta Queen's nervous young purser, a man whose obsession with precise record-keeping bordered on the pathological. Over several carefully orchestrated conversations in the boat's smoking lounge, Thorne learned that Wickham took enormous pride in maintaining what he called the most accurate provisioning records on the Mississippi, documentation so detailed that it tracked every pound of meat, every barrel of flour, every bottle of wine that came aboard the vessel. "The secret to profitable river operations," Wickham explained, with the earnest enthusiasm of a man discussing his life's work, "is controlling costs through meticulous inventory management. I can tell you exactly how much we spend on provisions per passenger per day, down to the penny." Thorne's pulse quickened as he realized the implications of such detailed record-keeping. If Chef Rook was indeed serving human flesh to the passengers, then the boat's legitimate meat purchases should be insufficient to account for the elaborate meals being served in the dining salon. The mathematics of murder, he reasoned, would leave traces in the most mundane of places, the accounting ledgers that tracked the Delta Queen's operating expenses. Under the pretense of writing an article about river commerce for a Chicago newspaper, Thorne convinced Wickham to share selected portions of the provisioning records. What he discovered sent ice water through his veins and confirmed his worst suspicions about the true nature of Chef Rook's culinary artistry. According to the meticulously maintained ledgers, the Delta Queen had purchased exactly 2,400 pounds of fresh meat during the 6-month operating season, a quantity that Wickham proudly noted represented a significant cost savings over previous years. Yet Thorne's own observations of the dining salon revealed meals of extraordinary abundance and variety, with passengers regularly praising Chef Rook for serving cuts of beef, pork, and game that seemed far superior to anything that could be procured through normal commercial channels. The mathematical impossibility became even more stark when Thorne calculated the actual consumption. With an average of 100 passengers and 50 crew members aboard, serving 3 meals per day over 6 months, the boat should have required at least 8,000 pounds of meat to maintain the standards of cuisine that had made the Delta Queen famous throughout the river trade. But the most chilling discovery came when Thorne examined the timing of the meat purchases in relation to passenger disappearances. The records showed that Chef Rook had not requisitioned any fresh meat deliveries for nearly 3 weeks, yet the quality and quantity of meals had actually improved during that same period. The dates corresponded exactly with the vanishings of Harold Pembroke, Eleanor Hartwell, and two other passengers whose disappearances had been quietly attributed to accidental drownings. Even more damning was a coded entry Thorne discovered buried deep in the steamship line's financial records, a payment authorization for what was euphemistically described as Captain's Discretionary Bonus, End of Season Performance Incentive. The amount, $500, represented more money than most riverboat captains earned in an entire year, and it was scheduled to be paid immediately following the Delta Queen's final voyage of the season. The entry was countersigned by someone identified only as SR, in a handwriting that matched samples Thorne had observed on Chef Rook's menu cards and requisition forms. The implication was unmistakable. Captain Holloway was receiving substantial payments in exchange for his silence and cooperation, making him not merely a passive observer of the horrors taking place in his galley, but an active participant in a conspiracy that treated human beings as livestock. As Thorne sat in his stateroom that evening, staring at the copied figures by lamplight, he realized that the Delta Queen had become something far more sinister than a simple murder scene. It was a commercial enterprise built on cannibalism, a floating abattoir where human flesh was processed and served to unwitting customers who paid premium prices for the privilege of consuming their fellow passengers. The horror was no longer just the act of a deranged individual, but a sanctioned business operation with profit margins calculated in human lives and customer satisfaction, measured in the consumption of carefully prepared murder. By November 4th, Elias Thorne had reached the grim conclusion that he was running out of time. The Delta Queen was scheduled to complete her final voyage of the season within days, after which Chef Rook and his monstrous operation would disappear into the winter months, likely to resurface on another vessel under a different name. If Thorne was going to expose the truth, he would have to act immediately, regardless of the personal risk. The plan he devised was born of desperation and professional instinct in equal measure. He enlisted Tom Grady's reluctant assistance, appealing to the carpenter's growing horror at his unwitting complicity in the boat's modifications. Grady agreed to create a diversion by reporting a suspicious leak in the engine room that would require Captain Holloway's immediate attention, drawing him away from the galley area during the crucial midnight hour when Rook typically conducted his most private work. Armed with a crowbar borrowed from the ship's tool locker and a hurricane lantern that cast dancing shadows in the narrow service corridors, Thorne made his way through the Delta Queen's lower decks, like a man descending into hell itself. The familiar sounds of the boat at night, the creaking of timber and the rhythmic splash of the paddle wheel, seemed to take on an ominous quality that made every shadow a potential threat. The galley stood empty in the flickering lamplight, its surfaces gleaming with the obsessive cleanliness that Chef Rook maintained to conceal his crimes. But it was the cold locker that drew Thorne's attention like a magnet, its heavy door standing slightly ajar as if inviting investigation. The metallic smell he had noticed during the official search was stronger now, mixed with something sweetly corrupt that made his stomach lurch with recognition. Using the crowbar to pry open the heavy door, Thorne stepped into a chamber that would haunt his nightmares for the remainder of his life. The cold locker had been transformed into a butcher's workshop that combined surgical precision with industrial efficiency. Meat hooks hung from the ceiling in neat rows, while a complex system of drains and sluices carried away the evidence of Rook's work. Along one wall, carefully wrapped parcels bore labels written in the chef's precise handwriting: prime cut, Nov 2, and stewing meat, Oct 28. But it was the discovery of Eleanor Hartwell's distinctive cameo brooch, still pinned to a fragment of blood-stained fabric, that provided the final, irrefutable proof of the horror that had been taking place within these walls. The school teacher's personal effects lay neatly arranged on a shelf like trophies alongside similar collections that told the story of previous victims: a traveling salesman's gold watch, a gambler's distinctive ring, a widow's pearl earrings. Thorne was so absorbed in cataloging the evidence that he failed to notice the soft footsteps approaching behind him until a familiar voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "I wondered when you would finally work up the courage to look," Chef Rook said, with the calm satisfaction of a man whose deepest secrets had finally been acknowledged. "You've been circling around the truth like a nervous cat, Mr. Thorne. I respect persistence, even when it becomes inconvenient." Thorne spun around to find Rook standing in the doorway, blocking his only avenue of escape. The chef appeared completely at ease, as if discovering a passenger in his private charnel house was merely a minor interruption in his evening routine. In his hand, he held the bone-handled cleaver that had become the instrument of so much death, its ivory grip gleaming in the lamplight. "You don't seem surprised," Thorne managed to say, his hand tightening on the crowbar as he calculated the distance between himself and the door. Rook's smile was genuinely amused, the expression of a craftsman who had finally found someone capable of appreciating his work. "Surprised? Mr. Thorne, I've been watching you watch me for weeks. A man in my profession learns to recognize the signs of professional interest. The question is, what do you intend to do with your newfound knowledge?" "What any civilized man would do," Thorne replied, though his voice betrayed the fear that was rapidly overtaking his detective's composure. "I'm going to see you hanged for what you've done to these people." Rook's laughter was soft and genuinely delighted. "Civilized? Oh, Mr. Thorne, you still don't understand, do you? What I do here is no different from what happens in every slaughterhouse in America. The only difference is that I serve a more exclusive clientele, and my ingredients are considerably more tender than anything you'll find in a Chicago stockyard." What Elias Thorne had expected was a confession, perhaps even a struggle between himself and the deranged chef who had turned the Delta Queen into a floating house of horrors. What he had not anticipated was the calm, almost professorial manner in which Silas Rook began to explain the true scope of the operation that Thorne had only begun to uncover. "You think this is the work of one mad cook," Rook said, setting his cleaver down on a nearby cutting board with deliberate care. "But you're seeing only the smallest piece of something much larger, Mr. Thorne, much more organized, much more profitable." As Rook spoke, his accent seemed to shift and thicken, revealing the deep swamp patois that he usually kept carefully hidden beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. The transformation was unsettling, as if the civilized chef was peeling away to reveal something far more primitive underneath. "The gutter folk you've heard whispered about, they ain't just river pirates stealing cargo and livestock. They're my blood, Mr. Thorne, my family, and this boat. She's just the dining room for an operation that stretches from New Orleans clear up to Memphis." The revelation hit Thorne like a physical blow. What he had assumed was the isolated madness of a single individual was actually part of a vast criminal enterprise that had been operating under the noses of law enforcement for years. The gutter folk weren't merely legends used to frighten children, but a functioning clan of predators who used the river system as their hunting ground. "We take the small boats first," Rook continued with the matter-of-fact tone of a businessman, explaining his supply chain. "Fishermen, trappers, folks who travel alone and won't be missed for weeks. But the big money, the real profit, comes from places like this, passengers who pay premium prices to eat what they think is the finest cuisine on the river." Rook's explanation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps on the galley stairs. Captain Holloway appeared in the doorway, but instead of the shocked outrage Thorne expected, The captain's face showed only weary resignation mixed with genuine fear. "Rook, what the hell are you doing?" Holloway demanded, though his voice carried no real authority. "We agreed this kind of conversation was off limits." "Mr. Thorne here has been very persistent," Rook replied calmly. Seemed rude not to satisfy his curiosity, especially since he won't be in any position to share what he's learned. The implication sent adrenaline surging through Thorne's system. He raised the crowbar defensively, but found himself trapped between Rook's calm menace and Captain Holloway's obvious complicity. The captain wasn't there to rescue him, but to help cover up yet another disappearance. "This has gone too far," Holloway said, though whether he was addressing Rook or Thorne was unclear. "The steamship line can't afford this kind of attention. We were supposed to keep things quiet, professional." "Professional?" Thorne couldn't contain his disgust. "You call serving human flesh to paying customers professional?" Holloway's face flushed with anger and shame in equal measure. "You don't understand the economics, the pressures we're under. River trade is dying. Steamships are being replaced by railroads. We needed something to set us apart, to make the Delta Queen special enough that people would pay premium prices." The captain's justification was interrupted by a sudden commotion from the upper decks. The sound of running feet and shouted orders that suggested something had gone wrong with their carefully planned confrontation. Tom Grady's voice could be heard calling for Captain Holloway, reporting what sounded like a genuine emergency in the engine room. In the moment of confusion that followed, Thorne saw his opportunity. He swung the crowbar at the hurricane lantern, plunging the cold locker into darkness as glass shattered and kerosene splashed across the floor. In the chaos that followed, with Holloway cursing and Rook moving with deadly purpose through the blackness, Thorne fought his way toward the galley door with desperate strength born of absolute terror. He could hear Rook's voice behind him, no longer calm but filled with the cold fury of a predator whose prey had slipped the trap. "You can run, Mr. Thorne, but there ain't nowhere on this boat you can hide from family. We know every board, every nail, every shadow." The sound of splashing from outside suggested that Rook had chosen escape over confrontation, abandoning ship to rejoin his clan in the dark waters of the swamp rather than risk capture and exposure of the larger operation. In the immediate aftermath of that horrific November night, as Tom Grady helped pull a shaken Elias Thorne from the smoke-filled galley and Captain Holloway stood paralyzed by the collapse of his carefully constructed world, the machinery of cover-up began to operate with the same ruthless efficiency that had concealed months of murder and cannibalism. The Delta Queen limped into port at New Orleans 3 days later. Her final voyage of the season cut mysteriously short due to what the steamship line's representatives described as mechanical difficulties requiring immediate attention. Passengers were offered full refunds and complimentary accommodations at the finest hotels while they arranged alternative transportation, a gesture of goodwill that effectively silenced most potential complaints about the voyage's abrupt conclusion. Within a week of docking, the great riverboat was surrounded by workmen who swarmed over her decks like ants, ostensibly preparing her for the extensive renovations that would transform her galley and dining facilities. The Crescent Star, steamship line's ledgers recorded the expenditure as comprehensive modernization of food service infrastructure, a euphemism that concealed the complete gutting and rebuilding of every space where Chef Rook had practiced his monstrous craft. The cold locker where Thorne had discovered the evidence of systematic butchery was removed entirely, its contents incinerated in a foundry furnace that reduced metal, wood, and any lingering organic matter to anonymous ash. The galley's specialized drainage system, so carefully installed by the unknowing Tom Grady, was torn out and replaced with conventional plumbing that bore no resemblance to the efficient disposal network that had carried away the evidence of human slaughter. Captain Jedediah Holloway received his promised bonus, a sum large enough to purchase a comfortable retirement cottage in rural Alabama, where he lived out his remaining years as a broken man who spoke to no one about his decades on the river. The payment was recorded in the steamship line's books as a Meritorious Service Award, recognition for his outstanding dedication to passenger safety and satisfaction. Dr. Havelock, the ship's alcoholic physician who had signed so many death certificates without asking inconvenient questions, found his services no longer required by the steamship line. He disappeared into the anonymous depths of New Orleans' medical underworld, where physicians who asked no questions about their patients' injuries could always find employment among the city's criminal element. Elias Thorne's official report to the Pinkerton Detective Agency was filed in a folder marked "Case Closed, Insufficient Evidence for Prosecution," then buried so deeply in the agency's archives that it would never again see daylight. The Pinkertons valued their lucrative contracts with the steamship companies far too much to allow a single detective's traumatic experience to jeopardize profitable business relationships. The missing passengers were officially recorded as victims of tragic accidents, their deaths attributed to the inherent dangers of river travel in an era when such fatalities were common enough to attract little attention from authorities. Eleanor Hartwell's family received a letter of condolence from the steamship line, along with a small settlement that acknowledged their moral responsibility for the accident while carefully avoiding any admission of legal liability. By the spring of 1888, the Delta Queen had been quietly sold to a scrap dealer who broke her up for parts, her distinctive paddle wheel and brass fittings distributed among a dozen smaller vessels that carried no trace of her dark history. The great dining salon where passengers had unknowingly consumed human flesh was reduced to lumber that eventually found its way into the construction of a New Orleans orphanage, a final irony that would have amused Chef Rook had he known of it. The official memory of the Delta Queen became one of mechanical failure and economic necessity, a casualty of the changing times that saw steam replaced by steel and rivers superseded by railways. Only a few scattered individuals carried the true story into history, and most of them were too traumatized or too complicit to ever speak of what they had witnessed in the fog-shrouded waters of the lower Mississippi. More than a century has passed since the Delta Queen made her final, blood-soaked voyage down the Mississippi. Yet the story refuses to remain buried in the muddy depths where the steamship line's executives hoped it would rest forever. River historians have long puzzled over the abrupt end of what had been one of the most profitable luxury vessels on the lower Mississippi, noting the curious absence of detailed records from her final season and the suspicious gaps in passenger manifests that suggest systematic destruction of evidence. Modern maritime archaeologists working in the waters near Honey Island Swamp occasionally report sonar contacts that match the dimensions of the missing riverboat, though the shifting sediments and treacherous currents of the region have prevented any systematic exploration of what might lie beneath the surface. Local dive shops tell tourists stories of a ghost wreck that appears and disappears depending on river conditions, sometimes visible in the murky water during periods of extreme low flow, but always just beyond the reach of conventional salvage equipment. The growing fascination with what historians now call dark tourism has brought increasing attention to the legend of Chef Rook and his floating abattoir. River cruise companies operating out of New Orleans offer themed excursions that promise to follow the route of the original Delta Queen, complete with historical reenactors portraying the vessel's final passengers and crew. These sanitized versions of the story focus on the mystery and gothic atmosphere while carefully avoiding the more disturbing details of systematic cannibalism and institutional cover-up. More unsettling are the parallels that folklorists have identified between the Delta Queen case and similar legends of cannibalism aboard isolated conveyances throughout American history. Train crews in the remote stretches of the Transcontinental Railroad spoke of dining car chefs who seemed to know too much about butchery, while Great Lakes shipping companies recorded unusual numbers of passenger disappearances on vessels that served uncommonly elaborate meals during the harshest winter months when supply deliveries were impossible. The descendants of the gutter folk, if indeed they still exist in the deepest reaches of the Louisiana bayous, remain as elusive as their ancestors. Occasional reports filter out of the swamp country describing encounters with pale, silent figures in rotting boats who seem to watch river traffic with predatory interest, but these sightings are typically dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations, fueled by too much local folklore and cheap whiskey. Perhaps most chilling of all is the artifact that surfaced in 1998 when a commercial fisherman's nets pulled a bone-handled cleaver from the river mud near the spot where sonar had detected the mysterious wreck. The ivory grip bore carved symbols that matched no known cultural tradition, while forensic analysis of microscopic residue embedded in the blade revealed protein traces that were disturbingly human in origin. The cleaver disappeared from the Louisiana State Museum's collection within days of its authentication, stolen by parties unknown who left no trace of their identity or motives. The river keeps its secrets well, but sometimes the current washes up fragments that remind us of the horrors that once traveled these waters. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the Delta Queen legend, the possibility that somewhere in the vast network of American waterways, the tradition of Chef Rook continues, adapted to modern times but fundamentally unchanged in its savage efficiency. In the end, what makes the story of the Delta Queen so deeply unsettling is not the grotesque acts of Chef Silas Rook, horrific as they were, but rather the banality of the evil that surrounded and enabled his monstrous enterprise. Rook was, when stripped of legend and folklore, simply a man doing what he believed to be his job with professional competence and pride in his craft. The true horror lay in the web of willful ignorance that allowed him to operate with impunity for months. Captain Holloway chose profit over conscience, Dr. Havelock chose alcohol over duty, and the steamship line's executives chose corporate reputation over human life. Each made their individual decision to look away, to ask no questions, to accept convenient explanations rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The passengers themselves were not entirely innocent in this transaction. They praised the extraordinary meals, they savored the exceptional flavors, and they never inquired too deeply about the source of their culinary pleasure. In their eagerness to consume luxury, they became unwitting participants in an act of communion far more intimate and horrifying than any of them could have imagined. This willingness to remain ignorant in the face of obvious signs, to choose comfort over curiosity, speaks to a fundamental weakness in human nature that transcends any particular historical period. The Delta Queen could happen again, has perhaps happened again, in forms we have not yet recognized or acknowledged. The legend persists because it reminds us that civilization is nothing more than an agreement to pretend we are not still animals, and that agreement can be broken by anyone willing to serve our appetites, while we choose not to ask what feeds them. And perhaps that is the most terrifying lesson of all, that the line between a gourmet meal and a sacrament of horror is only as wide as your own willful ignorance.